We've been talking a lot about game theory, and especially games in which it's possible for people to achieve better outcomes through cooperation. So prisoner's dilemmas, or a case where the Nash Equilibrium leads you to mutual defection, but you could do better if you cooperated. In a stag hunt, the situation is, well, I'm better off cooperating if you do, but if you don't, I'm better off defecting. And so there are really two Nash equilibria, mutual defection and mutual cooperation. Mutual cooperation's better, and so if we work together, we can do that. But on the other hand, if I don't trust you, I'm in real danger. And so both of those are cases where you might say cooperation has real benefits. But what about a situation where our interests on a given issue are diametrically opposed? Now, it may be that no human beings ever have completely diametrically opposed interests on every single question. But on particular questions, sometimes they really are. Sometimes, if there are four options, my preferences are, well, first choice, second choice, third choice, fourth choice. And yours really are fourth choice, third choice, second choice, first choice. Okay? And in that situation, notice there is no possibility of cooperation at all. Anything that improves my situation makes your situation worse. And so in this kind of situation, we have a circumstance of pure competition, we might say. Now, how do we deal with pure competition? It would be nice to define an ethical world where pure competition never happened, or where we could say, well, just as long as you stay within these general bounds, you're good. But I think that leaves out a huge amount. We want to know both how to behave ethically, but also how to approach situations like this. It's great to say, let's cooperate, let's do tit for tat, or let's be sure to be nice and lead by cooperation. But then when you face this, and look, in organizations, you are often going to face this. There will be a group of young junior people hired, for example, and only one is going to make partner. And you want it to be you and not the other people. Or there might be a competition between various companies. You want to beat that other new startup to market with your product. And to the extent that you speed up your process, that works against their interests and in favor of yours. And so this kind of thing happens all the time. It's going to happen especially if you see yourself as an agent of change in some way in your organization. You come in and think, these people are a mess, but I can do better. That requires a certain level of chutzpah. When you're first starting out, though I remember those days when I had that chutzpah. But later, as your career advances, it's more and more likely. You're going to come in, you're going to be appointed, let's say, manager of some group, and somebody else will be doing things. And sometimes, look, it is, hey, this is working great. All I have to do is just kind of keep it going. And it's important to recognize when that's the case. But sometimes you say, yeah, this is kind of a mess. I have to do something about this. And there are going to be reasons why it's a mess. Some people's entrenched interests are going to be working against you. And so you will find that in that attempt to change things, you've got certain enemies. And you'll be in a situation of this pure competition with at least some people who want it to be the way it is. Anyway, this kind of thing can happen a lot, even outside of outright warfare, though it happens a lot in warfare too. So it's become popular over the past couple of decades, really, in business for people to read things on military strategy, to understand the art of management. Now, in general, you might say, wait, managing people isn't warfare. Or maybe, it lends itself to this Marxist class struggle, the bourgeoisie oppress the proletariat thing. But that's not what I mean. I mean really just that you have to think not only what are the general bounds within which I've got to behave, but also how do I approach a situation like this? How do I think it through? And it's too simple in a way to say, well, this part is ethics, this part is purely self-interest or prudence. To some extent, you have to think, how do I deal with a situation like this? How aggressive should I be? How deferential should I be? Just what's at stake for me? Where do I fight? Where do I know not to fight? There are a lot of subtle questions here. Aristotle would have thought, yeah, all of those questions are involved in matters of courage, in matters of judgment, wisdom. And so this isn't something that we can just easily push aside and say, well, that's not ethics, that's something else. I think it is ethics in that broad sense. How do we live is going to include how we deal with situations of pure competition, how we actually oppose someone else whose interests are very different from ours. Okay, so we're going to look at a number of works here, primarily Sun Tzu's The Art of War, and then we're going to look at John Boyd's Discourse on Winning and Losing to try to understand how they approach this. I'll try to talk about some other theorists as well as we go to give you some sense of how, in a military context, people have thought about this. I know when I was chairman of the philosophy department for 10 years, the most important book that I consulted was The Art of War. Someone gave me a copy of The Prince, saying that will be the best thing for you. But he gave me a copy in Italian. And, and I can read Italian, but you know, it's like not my favorite thing to do. But I mean, there are English translations, and I started looking at English translations. But it seemed to me that The Art of War actually captured things that were more relevant to my situation. I mean, better to be feared than loved, Machiavelli says. But I was like, well, I'm neither feared nor loved, so where does that leave me? So anyway, let's take a look at The Art of War. This is a text that was, well, supposedly anyway, written by Sun Tzu, a Chinese general, who lived from around the middle of the 6th century BC into the 5th century. So most people think this is a text that dates from about 500 BC. Other scholars think it's a bit later, a compilation of things that were sayings, kind of like Confucius's Analects, or compilations of Confucius's sayings that took shape somewhat later than Confucius's actual life. And so if that's true, it was probably, so those scholars tend to date it around 400 BC. Anyway, we're now 100 to 200 years before Aristotle, for example. And we get an account that is trying to understand this kind of situation and how we approach it. Now, I want to, before we get into the details of what Sun Tzu says, dispel a possible misunderstanding and link this up to game theory. You might think that in this kind of situation, there is no possibility of a dominant strategy, that there's no possibility of even Nash Equilibrium. That is not true. In fact, really, if you think about the various forms of games, you realize that in this configuration, if we just think about the ordinal values and to think about two players with two options each, there are really only three basic games that you have to confront. So what would they be? Well, they would be this. I've got this as my first choice. This is my second. Let's say I'm player A, my third, my fourth. Then the other player has these options. Okay? Now, what happens there? Well, as player A, I prefer my first choice to my third, my second choice to my fourth. Player B says, well, I get to choose between these two, so I prefer my third choice to my fourth, my first to my second. So notice what happens here. If we chart the arrows, we say, well, okay, we get a Nash equilibrium right here. In fact, A thinks, hey, look, I'm better off with this option, no matter what the other player is doing, so this is my dominant strategy. B says, well, look, the arrows point in the same direction. I'm better off doing this, no matter what the other player does. And so we end up here. Now notice, I'm not labeling these options anymore as cooperate or defect, because there is no possibility of cooperation. So there's nothing that would really count as cooperating or defecting here. Often, you could say, well, one of these is kind of a more aggressive stance, another is a more defensive stance, but that's not always going to be the case. If I'm going, let's say I'm playing hockey and I'm going up to the goal, and the goalie's trying to defend, and I think, well, I can hit it to the right or the left. It's not like one of those is more aggressive than the other, really. Or I'm playing tennis. I think I can hit it with forehand or backhand. Well, gosh, one isn't really necessarily more aggressive than the other. So we end up, notice, with dominant strategies, two dominant strategies, and a Nash equilibrium here. So the fact that we're in a situation of pure competition doesn't necessarily mean we won't end up this way. And indeed, this was the type of situation we saw in one of the homework problems. Now here is a second form that this might take. Suppose I've got that, that, this, that. So I rank these options now 1, 3, 4, and 2. You rank them just the reverse. Well, I think it through as player A. I think I prefer my first choice to my fourth, but I prefer my second to my third. So I don't have a dominant strategy. And then B is going to think, well, I prefer my second choice to my fourth choice. I prefer, however, my first choice to my second choice. So now look at the way the arrows go. They just lead me around this square. Okay, so nobody has a dominant strategy. There is no Nash equilibrium. So here we've got one pure strategy Nash equilibrium. Here we have none. And then there's one other option, really. There are many other different forms if you think about the possible ways of arranging these numbers, but they all end up being equivalent by just swapping the options or swapping the players, etc. So the other option is this. Now, if I think that through, and I'm player A, I prefer my first choice to my second, my third to my fourth, however, I have no dominant strategy. B says, well, I prefer my first to my fourth and my second to my third, so actually I do have a dominant strategy. Now again, trace the arrows around. Gosh, we end up here. So we end up with one Nash equilibrium. One player here has a dominant strategy. Well, the point of that little exercise is just to say that we can have dominant strategies. And sometimes in this situation of pure competition, that will be true, right? You're better off doing this no matter what the other player does. What would be a situation of pure competition? It might be warfare, it might be in an organization, it might be in some sort of sporting event or team where you do have a dominant strategy. You're going to be better off doing it no matter what the other player does. Yeah?
Well, they used to use this example, but like farming. So like, I don't know, it's a crop. The cotton will, I don't know, weeds, some people grow that no matter what you do, you're better off growing because even if the price gets pushed so far down, it's like offsetting like hour because then you're getting nothing. And this is before government subsidies and everything.
Ooh, okay, good. You're competing with other farmers in your case, but it could be other oil producers, all sorts of things like this. And you're thinking, well, look, I realize that what I do has an effect on the price in the marketplace, but it has a pretty small effect. And basically, if I grow more of the crop or I produce more oil, I'm going to be getting more money. And so you might think, I'm better off producing more no matter what anybody else is doing. Which is, by the way, part of the reason that cartels like OPEC or other price-fixing schemes tend to break down. It's because I realize, yeah, it's better for me if the price is high, but on the other hand, given that my actions don't have that big an effect on the price, I've got an incentive to cheat and do this. It's also part of the reason a climate change accord is a very difficult thing to enforce. It's like everybody's got a powerful incentive to cheat. The same thing is true why environmental controls are difficult. Like, yeah, I don't want polluted rivers, but on the other hand, what difference does my additional pollution make, right? So anyway, there are lots of ways in which this kind of consideration breaks apart, attempts to establish a kind of collusion like that. Anyway, that's a good point. So that would be a situation where I do have a dominant strategy. Can you think of a case, though, where there is no dominant strategy? No pure strategy. Anyway, there might be a mixed strategy that's my best, some probability mixture over the actions. Yeah?
If the other side's fighting on the hill, you want to fight at the other hill. If the other side's fighting in the valley, you want to use your archers or something. So it changes based on what the other person's doing.
Okay, good. Often in battle, you're going to adapt to what the other player is doing. So what should you do? Well, it depends what they're doing, right? You have to remain flexible and make a lot of decisions in the field. Do you want to advance and try to take that hill? Do you want to stay on the hilltop? Depends what the other person's doing. And in fact, I love to show students plans of battle sometimes. It's very interesting to see, for example, the American plan and the Japanese plan going into the Battle of Coral Sea. This is what they were going to do. And then you see the actual ship movements. And there's very little relation between the first two and the second two. And it's a very common thing in military strategy that it's important to plan, but on the other hand, the moment battle starts, the plans have to change very quickly. I mean, they adapt to the other player. And that's usually a sign, yeah, there's no real Nash equilibrium. You can make a plan and predict what the other people are going to do, but you've got to adapt to what they do. So that's some indication you're in this type of situation. It's going to change rapidly. Think about a football game. You're calling plays. Do you think, well, we're better off passing no matter what? Hey, if the pass is complete, we gain 15 yards. If we run pretty successfully, we'll average 4 yards. So we should always pass. Is that right? No, right? Because if the other people know you're going to pass, they're going to say, we're going to do it. So in short, you have to mix these up in some way. And that's a sign there's no Nash equilibrium. You've got to have a probability distribution of them. Same thing with that hockey player going in toward the goal. If I always hit it to the right, the goalie knows exactly what to do. So I've got to mix it up. And much competition is like that. You can't usually just say, oh, well, I'm better off no matter what doing this. Now, it could be that if that's your strength, there's a slogan that people have sometimes, dance with the one that brung ya. That sounds, well, I don't like thinking of a dance as a pure competition this way, but still, the idea is, look, some strength got you here. Go with your strength. And that's almost like saying, look, you do have a pure strategy now. You do have a dominant strategy. Your dominant strategy is to just go with your strength. And if your strength is really that much better than your weakness, say you're a tennis player and your forehand is great, but your backhand's terrible. It might be that you're better off trying to hit everything forehand. That could happen, but it's usually a sign you've got a serious weakness if that's true. Usually you have to mix it up. Okay. Now, let's look at Sun Tzu. Actually, that's a bad pronunciation, but I got used to saying it because I named a cat after this book. And so for, 17 years, I got used to saying it that way. And really, it should be something like Sun Tzu. But I now think of the cat, so I can't stop doing it. Anyway, here is the idea. Right at the beginning of the text, we get this. The art of war is governed by 5 constant factors to be taken into account in one's deliberations when seeking to determine the conditions obtaining in the field. These are 1. This translation has the moral law. I'm not going to write that down because I think that's quite misleading. The Chinese is the Tao. Okay, and we'll talk about that in a minute. 2nd, heaven. 3rd, earth. 4th, the commander. 5th, method and discipline. Well, these are the things that success depends on. These are the things you have to focus on. Now, what are they? Well, first of all, let's talk about the Tao. There are very different understandings of the Tao in Chinese thought. The Confucian idea is that the Tao is the way, the path, the proper way to live. Okay? And that's behind this idea of translating it as the moral law, or moral influence, one translation has. And so there is this sense in which it is talking about the way things ought to be, okay, the proper path. So we could just write what things ought to be, how things ought to go, etc. Okay? But in Taoism, the Tao has a very different significance. The Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao, says the Tao Te Ching. The Tao in that sense is different. it talks about the way the universe works. The Tao is sort of this underlying unity, but it's dynamic, and it's, in short, not so much what things ought to be, but just what things are, how things work, how the universe works. And I think both of those meanings are going on here. In fact, even in Taoism, this is really, one scholar puts it this way, it's not only a guiding principle, but a regulating principle. So think about the Tao that underlies an apple, for example. It doesn't just indicate what the nature of the apple is, how apples tend to grow and behave and so forth. But it also tells us something about what an apple ought to be, what a good apple is. And so the Tao is something that has this normative aspect as well as a sort of more descriptive aspect. And according to Taoism, everything is like that. So to some extent, how we read this is going to depend, do we think this is a Confucian text or a Taoist text? And if it's both in some ways, what kind of mixture? Well, really, if it dates from the time it does, Sun Tzu is roughly a contemporary of Lao Tzu and Confucius. So I think there's some reason to think that both influences are going on, but it's probably, most people would think this text is more strongly Taoist. And if that's right, although this sounds very Confucian, the emphasis on method and discipline, but if it's got this strong Taoist element, then this idea of just how things work. So in short, you've got to understand the Tao. The leader has to understand, in our context, the organization, has to understand people, has to understand how things work and how they ought to work. Now, those are both really important. If you don't understand the situation, this is really the specific context, the situational aspect. But if you don't understand the general ideas, so you might say, this really involves a general understanding. But it does also have an ethical dimension to it. Because after all, what Sun Tzu goes on to say is this: the Tao causes the people to be in complete accord with their ruler. They'll follow him regardless of their lives, undismayed by any danger. So this is what unites the group. The whole point of this is that it unites. It gets people to act. It motivates. And that means there has to be an understanding. But not just an understanding of how things go. There has to be an understanding of how things ought to be. In other words, if I don't have a vision as a leader, I'm not going to be able to lead people to it. I've got to make sure people share my vision. And I've got to understand things well enough that people are going to nod their heads yes. So I might have a vision that is completely divorced from reality. And if I do that, then people, I hope, aren't going to follow me. Now, maybe they will if they share that diluted vision. But, oh gosh, I saw an example of this just the other day. I am not myself on Twitter. I think Twitter is a cesspool of human ignorance. And I prefer not to, confront that underlying reality myself. But anyway, somebody had tweeted that all of the recent events that have been going on can be explained through astrology. And they even got the astrological facts wrong about what's in Capricorn as opposed to what's in Saturn.
You said the burning of the Notre Dame?
Yes. Yes, okay, exactly. And so you think, wait a minute. Okay, so Notre Dame Cathedral catches fire because of some event in the stars that, actually they get wrong. That's not what's going on. But, yeah. So you think, well, okay, now suppose that person said, well, here's my vision. Everything is in the stars, Okay. There might have been a time when that was motivating. Now you would hope most people think, yeah, that's screwed up. That's not at all how things work. And so that's not going to really motivate. That's not going to unify. But a really good leader does understand the situation enough that people share that understanding and has a vision of what to do about it. So I think this tells you something important about what's involved in successful leadership and actually success in this situation of pure competition. You gotta know what you're facing. You've got to understand the basics. And you've got to have a vision of how things ought to be. And it better be the right one, Otherwise, I mean, for one thing, the fact that it's the right one is going to make it much more successful at uniting and motivating people. But if it's the wrong one even, well, it might do that for a while, but the thought will be eventually you're going to run into reality. So evil leaders can exist, and they can lead people for quite a while. But eventually, you would hope, that falls apart. Or at least Sun Tzu thinks it falls apart. You do have to have a vision that in the end makes sense. Now, there's a lot more, of course, that's involved in this. So the second thing, heaven. What does that mean? Night and day, cold and heat, times and seasons. In other words, these are the changeable, variable conditions. You have to realize for your success or failure, there are lots of things that can change. And you have to understand the dependence of what you're doing on that. So you have a plan in battle, but then you realize, wait, the weather's terrible. What do we do? Okay? The whole plan was to launch an amphibious naval attack, and now there's a tremendous storm going on, high waves. Oop, there went my plan. So you have to understand the things that are going to be relevant to success, that are going to change. And notice those are things beyond your, well, you can predict night and day, but you can't control it. Cold and heat, times and seasons, you can't really control those things. So the implication here is not only are they changeable and variable, they're outside your control. Understand that. Now, let's say you're in business and trying to launch a plan. You've got to think, well, okay, we're going to launch this product. A lot's going to depend on what kinds of variable circumstances. When the product actually hits the marketplace, there are going to be things relevant to our success. And there are things that can change. Right now, we know what they are. We don't know what they'll be in 18 months, let's say, when this thing rolls out of the factory door. What would matter? Good. All of these economic factors. What's the unemployment rate going to be? What is consumer confidence going to be? What's the general shape of the economy then? What is going to be happening with the inflation rate? What is our pricing going to look like by then? Et cetera, et cetera. All of those things. Will another competitor reach market before us? All of those things are things we can't really control, and they're highly variable. Right now, for example, we say, hey, the economy's going great. We think there'll be a big demand for this product. But what if by the time we launch, the country's in a recession? You've probably heard of the Edsel. That was one of the many things wrong with the Edsel. It was a car that, well, there were many things wrong. I won't go into all of it. But one of the things that was wrong is that they mapped out the idea to launch this new product line, because Edsel wasn't a particular model of car, it was a whole line. It was meant to be roughly the equivalent to General Motors' Oldsmobile line. We know what happened to that, so that's already one problem. One problem is they couldn't quite decide in pricing whether it was going to be more like Oldsmobile or more like Pontiac, so that's a problem. Mercury was supposed to be the equivalent to Buick, and Lincoln was supposed to be the equivalent to Cadillac, Ford, of course, to Chevrolet. But GM had these other two, and Ford said, we need something in the middle too, between a Ford and a Mercury. But what could it be? They thought. An Edsel. Okay, first of all, yeah, well, the naming is terrible. The fact that the front of it looked to most people like a horse collar, that wasn't great. Hey, remember that 19th century technology? Hey, you know. There were lots of things wrong, but one of the basic things wrong was that when the car came out, the country was in the recession of 1958 and 1959. When they were planning it out in 56 and 57, things looked awesome, right? The prosperity of the 50s. People are getting jobs, they're buying new cars, things are looking great. We want somebody to trade in their Ford and be able to trade in for something bigger and a little more luxurious and so on. It all made sense in good economic times, not at all in bad economic times. So there was, you might say, not full awareness of these conditions that get listed under heaven. Well then, what is earth? Earth comprises distances great and small, danger, security, open ground and narrow passes, the chances of life and death. Well, these are things that are, first of all, you might say fixed conditions. We're preparing for battle on a certain battleground, and the terrain is fixed. It's not like it's going to change. We can't predict the weather, but we can predict the coastline of France. If we're Eisenhower planning the Normandy invasion, for example, you can't think, well, the coastline's here right now, but gosh, within a week it could be totally different. It's not like that. It's pretty well fixed. Though notice also the chances of life and death. So we have to think about fixed conditions, including risks that we can predict reasonably. There are lots of fixed conditions like that one can face in an organization. To take that business example, what would the fixed conditions be for thinking about introducing this new product line? You think, well, yeah, we don't know what the economy is going to be like, whether people will feel confident of the future and be willing to buy a new product like this, et cetera. But there are certain fixed things we can predict pretty accurately. Like what? A lot of the costs that go into it, exactly. We can think, well, it's going to take these materials, right? So we know, and we can buy those right now. So we know what that is. We know what the costs of producing this thing are going to be. What are some other things that we can successfully judge right now? We can say, yeah, we understand those conditions. Yeah.
Comparison to existing products.
Good, we can look around at the existing products right now. Ford could say, hey, I know GM has these 5 car lines and we only have 3. And so that was a fixed condition. They were responding to that. Now, it could be that in the meantime, GM was going to introduce some dramatic new line, but you know, they had good reason to believe that wasn't going to happen. And so they could judge something about the existing products. Yeah, something new might emerge in the next year or two, but overall, they knew the general shape of the terrain. Well, then the commander makes a difference. The commander stands for the virtues of wisdom, oops, that's a typo, sincerity, benevolence, courage, and strictness. So we've got the commander and we've got certain key virtues. We're going to come back in a moment to what those key virtues are. But in short, if I'm thinking, okay, I'm competing with you, I want to win, I better understand the Tao. I better understand this game we're playing and understand how to do well in it. I better understand the variable circumstances that will be relevant to my success. I better understand the fixed conditions under which we'll be playing. I better have virtues, okay? And then I've got to have method and discipline. How do I actually structure my organization and control it? But for the moment, let's just talk about this part. What's an example of a game you might play yourself against someone else?
Chess.
Good, chess, okay? So how would we apply this to approaching a chess tournament? Well, you've got to understand the game of chess well, okay? You've got to understand how things ought to be, what are, sort of successful strategies. Now, by the way, this means more than just, oh, I know how the players move, and I know what checkmate is. Right? I mean, you can't just say, oh, yeah, I know people are going to shoot at other people in this battle, and I know one outcome is death, and one is survival. It's not that simple. Once a friend said, hey, do you play chess? And I said, well, I know how the players move. I had played, 3 or 4 times in junior high school at a friend's house. So I said, well, let's play. So we did, and I lost in there's one game that is like theoretically the shortest possible chess game. You can lose in 3 moves. I lost in 3 moves, okay? I knew how the pieces worked, and I knew how to define checkmate, but I sucked, okay? Now, why did I suck? Well, partly because understanding the Tao involves understanding more than just that. But part of it is I didn't have any relevant virtues, right? I didn't have any wisdom applied to that situation. I didn't know what a wise opening move is and what an unwise move is. I just knew, oh, I got 8 pawns. I could move each one 1 or 2 spaces. Yeah, that's 16 possible moves. Oh, I could move these little horsey dudes. That's like 4 possible moves. So I got 20 possible moves. I'll pick one. That was my way of, but that's not wisdom, okay, in thinking about this. So, partly this requires a certain depth of knowledge, a depth of understanding that I lacked, but partly too, you have to have the relevant virtues. Well, let's talk about what the virtues are. We're going to come back to this question several times over the next couple of weeks because we're going to be thinking about what leadership is. And here, Sun Tzu's already giving us something like a conception of leadership. What are the key virtues of a leader? Well, wisdom. Now, we must face a difficult philosophical question. What is wisdom? What is wisdom, actually? Intelligence plus time. That's not bad. We have to be smart enough to know what to do. We have to have enough experience to know what to do. Yeah.
I think a combination of knowledge and experience, and also a way of interpreting or going about unknown situations and being wise.
Wisdom is being wise. I like that, yes. Yeah, there are several things that a number of you have said that strike me as really good here. You have to have a certain level of knowledge. You have to have a certain ability to interpret what you know. You have to have a certain level of experience and the ability to interpret what you've experienced. And then there is this part that is hard to summarize, right? That you've just said, it's being wise, right? Yeah, knowing how to make a good choice, depending on that, right? Good judgment, exactly. So you've got to have good judgment about what to do in response to that. There are people who know a lot, but actually have terrible judgment. They're the people that Taleb refers to as intellectuals yet idiots. That's one of his favorite terms in the most recent book. Even as an abbreviation, an IYI, intellectual yet idiot. And what he roughly means is, look, somebody who's very smart, so yes, has intelligence, that was something somebody mentioned, and has a lot of knowledge, but nevertheless displays terrible judgment. And lots of people are like that. So wisdom, think of Aristotle. The person of practical wisdom, phronesis, is the one who can tell what is the right amount and what's going too far. The virtuous person, Aristotle said, does the right thing at the right time for the right reason in the right circumstance toward the right object. And how do they make that judgment? Well, it is a matter of judgment. It's knowing that, okay, this would be bravery, this would be rashness or foolishness, this would be cowardly. Where do you draw those lines? Requires judgment, it requires wisdom. And so it involves all of those things. So you sit down at that chess table across from somebody, you think, how much chess do they know? And how does my knowledge compare to them? How smart are they? And be careful here, because intelligence is often highly contextual. There are people who are tremendous chess masters who actually, and so they obviously have to have a high IQ to be able to envision lots of things, but they may not be able to apply that outside that context. Judgment is often highly context specific, which is part of the reason that intellectuals often sound like idiots when they talk about things they don't know very well. Then you move down to interpretation. The person has to be sensitive to the right things and interpret their experience and their knowledge in the right way. You can know a huge number of facts and have no idea what they mean or how to see patterns in them. You do have to have a certain amount of experience because that sensitivity is built up through experience. Aristotle said it's a waste of time to teach ethics to anybody under 30. They don't have enough experience. They're babes in the woods. And our culture rejects that, since they have me teaching ethics to you all. But on the other hand, there is a point to that. I've noticed that when I teach ethics to people who are over 30, and often well over 30, but sometimes not that far. And people who are under 30. It's a very different experience because they have different questions. They have different experiences. There are different things they see. They think of different examples. When I say, so what would be components of a good life, they have different answers. And that comes to a large extent just from experience. Not necessarily that those people know more or smarter. Often they're actually not as smart by most traditional measures, but they have seen a lot more and they have had to face real consequences and learned how to interpret certain things. Okay, so wisdom matters, but what else? Well, sincerity. Now, sincerity is something that is one of the key Confucian virtues. And it means more than honesty, though it does include honesty. It also means not deceiving yourself. So there's a level of self-knowledge, self-understanding here. And we're going to come back to that. Then what else? Well, not just sincerity and wisdom, but also benevolence, courage, and strictness. Benevolence in Chinese is the basic Confucian virtue, ren. Sometimes means virtue as a whole. But here, I think it means a real concern for people's welfare. If I'm the leader and I don't care about my troops at all, if I'm the boss and I have no interest in my employees, how am I going to do at uniting them, at motivating them, at getting us to be effective toward a goal? Well, maybe for a while, if my discipline is strong enough, I can do it. But look, the moment my people can leave, they're going to leave. And so I have to care about the people I'm directing. And then I've got, well, courage. I've got to be willing to accept risks in pursuit of our goals. If I can't accept risks, look, this situation is one where there are inherent risks, okay? Any gain for somebody else is a loss for me. So I'm at risk all the way through this thing. And then, strictness. I have to be strict. Now that's the one that isn't in Confucius, and it's not really in Taoism. It's quite foreign to Taoism. So that's Sun Tzu's own contribution. Why strictness? Yeah.
People ought to know your commandments or orders mean something.
Good, exactly. You've got to lead, and people have to understand. They have to have some reason to follow your direction. What if your directions are just suggestions? What if you say, not, all right, tomorrow we attack, but you say, I think it might be time to land in France. Hey, you want to take a boat out and go to France? And, might be a good time to do that. So the soldiers say, okay. Yeah, maybe we'll go to France tomorrow. Maybe that is the right time to attack. But others look at the foggy morning and the wind and say, yeah. That's no plan for success in battle, right? And the same thing is going to be true in your organization. Suppose Ford said, I'd like to develop this new product line. And some of the people said, maybe I'll do that. Others said, I like building Mercuries. That's not going to work. Suppose in an academic department, some people say, hey, let's do this kind of thing. Other people say, actually, this describes basically every academic department. No, I'm not going to do that. Well, it's pretty hard to lead a group where there is no effective discipline. That is actually one of the horrible difficulties of being a chair. You actually have almost no power over anyone. You are technically the leader, but actually, suppose some tenured professor thinks you're all wet. Nothing you can do about it. And the same thing is true in a surprising number of organizations, which makes them horribly difficult to lead. And so this isn't just a personal quality, it's going to depend on the organization.